So you've seen the picture of Dan Jasper, at least on your notice of today's meeting. And if you can find him, he's here with us today. And, you know, Dan looks like a nice young man, and he certainly is. However, this guy has a resume that, you know, any of us would be both envious of and exhausted by. He is, as Ted said, the policy advisor for Project Drawdown Lift program. It's a mouthful. He works on multidisciplinary solutions for climate change and poverty alleviation, particularly in South Asia, where he has worked, and sub-Saharan Africa. Dan draws upon over a decade of policy experience to advocate for climate financing, to simultaneously address poverty alleviation and climate resilience in low and middle income countries. He's spent a considerable amount of time working for the American Friends Service Committee, an organization many of us are quite familiar with. In case you don't know, Dan, a lot of the members of this organization are Quakers or have a Quaker background. So when he was in Asia, he did advocacy for peace, of course, and humanitarian cooperation, international development. He emphasized U.S.-North Korea and U.S.-China relations, sort of a fraught kind of piece of work in the United States, at least. He's also led efforts connecting food security and conservation agriculture to geopolitical stability and conflict resolution, an issue of particular interest in Africa right now. He's conducted major legislative and policy campaigns on issues such as ensuring humanitarian aid programs in sanctioned countries, calling on the North Korean War, trying to reunite Korean and Korean American families, supporting recovery operations for POWs and MIAs in Northeast Asia, trying to restart US-China bilateral dialogue process, enhancing climate diplomacy with North Korea and China, and reforming the use of sanctions. He's appeared on multiple media outlets, NBC, Reuters, New York Times, and so on. He worked at World Learning, where he administered the State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program. He's founder and primary author of streetcivics.com. As I think I mentioned, he served in the Peace Corps, assisting national ministries with local education programs. He worked in two highly different parts of the world, in Turkmenistan from 2008 to 2010, and then a much better assignment, Dan, in St. Lucia from 2013 to 2014. He also worked for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Minnesota House of Representatives, and a wonderful woman, Congresswoman Betty McCollum, also of Minnesota. He holds his master's degree in public policy from Duke after he earned his bachelor's degrees in, global studies, cultural studies, and linguistics from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And I'm tired from just reading it. Anyway, thanks so much, Dan, for coming along, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Mike. Take it away, Dan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike, for that overly generous introduction there. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, it looks like it's starting. Perfect.
Got it. Wonderful. I want to start by saying I am very impressed with SAFE's work. I spent some time looking through your materials. It's very clear that you all are thinking globally and acting locally already. You seem to be very well organized, especially for such a newly established organization. It seems like you're using every level of your agency, making building alterations, lobbying Congress. This is what Project Drawdown often advocates for, using those levels of agency to make real climate action. So I really commend you all for these actions and for all your work. I think it's quite incredible. Maybe you all can give me a presentation after this, actually. I think that puts you all in a really good position to be a trusted resource, not just for Kendall communities, but likely beyond as well. I think you all are probably learning a lot that other community members may not have time to dig into or may not have the expertise or resources to. So you all could be a really good resource for them. For this presentation, I'll cover 3 main points, and I will be relatively brief here. The first is a brief overview of Project Drawdown, in case you aren't familiar with it. The second is an overview of climate solutions that we identified at the global and regional level. And then the third are just some tips and tricks that might boost your local action. I will admit it was a little difficult to think about what tips I could give you because it does seem like you all are really on the ball. So these are advanced level tips, and I hope they'll be useful for you. So in case you're not familiar with Project Drawdown, we are a 100% remote, US-based nonprofit. We're known for the New York Times best-selling book, Drawdown, which came out in 2017. I saw that it's listed on SAFE's website. We really appreciate that. We did update the solutions in 2020 with the Drawdown review, and we added new solutions as recently as last year. So our mission is to help the world reach Drawdown as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. In case the term drawdown is new to some of you, it refers to the future point in time when levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start steadily declining. It's what the world obviously needs, as evidenced by the near weekly climate magnified disasters we're seeing around the world. Even here in the US, from wildfires in California to the hurricane last year in Florida, all of which have terrible and cascading consequences for local communities, national communities, and even regions. So Project Drawdown has identified 93 climate solutions to address climate change. You can find the details on our website at drawdown.org, and I'll just give you kind of a quick overview of what these are. The solutions are all interconnected, and we emphasize that we need all of them to reach Drawdown. We don't rank them, we need all of them simultaneously. Project Drawdown solutions are global in scope, and they are 1, currently available, 2, financially viable, 3, have a proven potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and 4, have sufficient data available to model the level of greenhouse gases that can be mitigated, reduced, or sequestered. Okay, so Project Drawdown Solutions addresses greenhouse gas emissions from each of these sectors. What I'll point out here quickly is that electricity production gets a lot of attention, I think, in the media. What doesn't get as much attention is food, agriculture, and land use. But notice they have about the same amount of emissions. So it's really critical that we start to elevate this idea that agriculture is just as important as a component to climate solutions as electricity production. Again, we need them both, but food and agriculture, I don't think gets as much attention. And I'll come back to this later in the presentation. So we recognize that rich countries like the US need to continue to decarbonize rapidly, and that renewable energy needs to be massively scaled up in both rich countries and around the world in developing countries, which is a unique challenge for developing countries. And I'll talk more about that in a minute too. So as we know, climate change touches all aspects of our lives as well as the health of the planet. So Project Drawdown's framework recognizes that major systemic change is required to reach Drawdown. So how do we do that? First, we can reduce the sources of greenhouse gases through solutions that focus on shifting to renewable electricity, increasing energy efficiency, reducing food waste and loss, and shifting diets. Those are some 4 big ones right there, but there are others as well. Second, we can support and enhance the sinks of carbon dioxide found in nature on land and sea by improving agriculture and agroforestry practices and protecting and restoring ecosystems. Finally, we can address inequities in society through people-centered solutions, like meeting everyone's desired family planning needs and ensuring access to universal, high-quality education. So we often talk about the 3 S's. So it's sources, sinks, and society. Okay, so I think many of you were probably familiar with some of that data. I want to introduce a little bit of some of our newer data that we came out with last year. It's what my work usually focuses on, which is looking at what can low and middle income countries do, or developing countries do, in order to address climate and poverty simultaneously. So a component that should not be forgotten for advocates is the relationship between climate and poverty. Climate change and poverty are inextricably linked. People living in poverty, particularly women and children, are more vulnerable to natural disasters, are commonly live in regions that have been and are projected to be most impacted by climate change. So 850 million people still cook using solid fuels like wood, charcoal, crop residues to cook their meals. And they suffer from the resulting household air pollution, particularly among women and children. Almost 600 million people across Africa still don't yet have access to electricity. So we need holistic frameworks to address climate and poverty more synergistically. So the Drawdown lifts the program, which I am part of, Climate Poverty Connections Report, which we launched last year, summarizes the evidence around the well-being benefits of 28 climate solutions with a focus on rural communities in Africa and South Asia. We recognize that people in these communities are often the first and worst impacted by climate change, yet they've contributed the least to the problem. For example, Africa's emissions are less than 4% of total global emissions to date. That's minuscule. So while the solutions included in Project Drawdown's overall framework focus on reducing emissions, the subset of solutions included in the Climate Poverty Connections Report all have multiple co-benefits for climate mitigation, adaptation, and human well-being. So there are means for developing countries to pursue renewable, low-carbon development pathways while also addressing the socioeconomic needs of their population. Okay, so again, we identified a subset of 28 Project Drawdown solutions that generate significant co-benefits for poverty reduction and overall well-being. They're shown as colored bubbles here. The gray bubbles represent the other Project Drawdown mitigation solutions. They're not included in this most recent report. So we grouped solutions with similar human well-being co-benefits together. For example, tropical and temperate forest restoration and protection, grassland protection, coastal wetland protection and restoration, and rewetting, and indigenous peoples forest tenure have similar co-benefits and are grouped together in brown right here, if you can see my cursor. So they're grouped together in brown as one solution group that we called Protecting and Restoring Ecosystems. So the report then focuses on 5 groups of solutions. Improving agriculture and agroforestry over here, that's a pretty big group. Protecting and restoring ecosystems, which I just mentioned. Fostering equality up here. Providing clean electricity over here. And also adopting clean cooking. Okay, and just a bit more on this. So in order to identify all these solutions, we reviewed over 450 reports and peer-reviewed articles to identify and summarize the evidence for human well-being benefits. So the left side of the figure shows the 5 climate solution groups. The second column shows each solutions group potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions between 2020 and 2050 at a global level. So how much could they reduce over 30 years, right? For instance, the Protecting and Restoring Ecosystems Solutions Group has an emissions reduction potential of 181.5 gigatons. That's right here. That's a lot. That's a considerable amount. On the right side of the figure, using teal and gray icons, we list all the human well-being dimension benefits generated by each climate solution group. The direct benefits are in teal and the indirect benefits are in gray. So another example, adopting clean cooking, this line here. It's with the purple bubble. It directly contributes to decreasing energy poverty, and it indirectly contributes to increasing income, better health, improving gender equality, and better education. Okay, so hopefully we can see through this example that properly designed and implemented policy for low carbon and resilient growth can also help address poverty and inequality, enabling people to live safer, more prosperous, more inclusive, and more sustainable lives. Okay, there don't have to be trade-offs between achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, if you're familiar with those, and climate action. I want to pause here and sort of, emphasize why I'm highlighting some of this, partly because it's what I work on the most, and it's newer data. The other part here is that I know that a lot of you, as was mentioned earlier, have a Quaker background. And I think we really need to consider how we can accompany those communities on the front line of climate change. And advocates in high-income countries have a particular role to play in advocating for more climate finance for these communities. Recently, maybe you heard that Janet Yellen visited Africa. One of her comments was that her biggest takeaway was that African ministers were saying they don't want there to be trade-offs between climate action and development. What we're saying is there doesn't have to be. We have the solutions for both of these things. We can address them both together. And so I want you to be I'm trying to avoid the word armed with this data. Maybe that's too violent of a metaphor, but at least have this data at the ready for when you have conversations with local leaders, especially members of Congress, who may be in a position to increase financing for this, and who may be skeptical about some of these approaches. So I just wanted to highlight that and make that clear. Okay, so we thought globally there. Now we can talk about how we can act locally and use all this information. Obviously, understanding that we have the solutions is part of the equation. The other part of that equation is leveraging that knowledge for actual change in our communities and beyond. Again, I will say SAFE seems to be doing a very excellent job at this already. So again, I have some very high-level advanced suggestions for you, but in the Q&A, I'm happy to get more into the weeds on things if you have particular questions. I'm happy to answer anything on a range of subjects we could talk about. The first thing I would think about is getting involved in or establishing coalitions with other organizations. So are there other similar groups for other senior communities that you could coordinate with? Are there local environmental coalitions more broadly that you could join? Or are there spaces that need coordination and could use your help? I would say that working in coordination with other like-minded organizations is one of the most powerful advocacy techniques. I've started a number of networks and coalitions, and that old adage about if you want to go far, if you go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. I think that really applies in advocacy. So finding those allies is really critical. Another point you could think about is direct meetings with lawmakers if you haven't done this already. You can also meet with their staff. Oftentimes you'll be, it's easier to get meetings with their staff. This is especially effective if you may work to maintain these relationships over time. Some advocacy organizations hold advocacy days. Basically, they'll pick one day of the year and they'll basically organize meetings between their supporters and their members of Congress. This has gotten a lot easier with COVID because congressional offices are more willing to have these meetings over Zoom. So we no longer have to bring all of our supporters physically to Washington. You can organize this from your homes. I would say these are some of the most impactful methods I've seen in advocacy, especially when they're done consistently. I will also say that the work that SAFE is doing to make your buildings and lifestyles more climate friendly gives you a lot of legitimacy when advocating, even if it's on environmental issues that aren't totally related to the building retrofitting. So I would suggest it might be good to include a narrative in SAFE's work when you're speaking and engaging with public lawmakers, whether you're writing a letter or you're speaking in person. When you give that blurb about SAFE's work, I would make sure you mention that work that you're doing on your buildings yourselves, because that will give you a lot of legitimacy. Okay, so following the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in August last year, local advocates will absolutely have to get good at helping their communities transition to more sustainable systems. You'll recall that the IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act, theoretically has $8,000 for every household to make changes. Now, I'm a renter, so I know that this can apply to renters as well as communities like Kendall. I believe that there are incentives for things like heat pump HVAC systems, electric stoves, heat pump water heaters, clothes dryers. All of these things may be eligible for tax rebates. So figuring out how to unlock those funds may be difficult and time-consuming for other members of the community. SAFE, I think, is in a really great position to provide resources, contacts, general know-how for these types of transitions, and to make sure that you flag opportunities for your neighbors. I would strongly recommend checking out Rewire America if you haven't done so already. They have a lot of information on this, and they, I think, are fast becoming sort of the go-to resource. The other one that I will mention is engaging in public forums. This is another important method. I think as retirees, you may have the flexibility to attend local government proceedings where you can get your local voice heard. I cannot stress enough how important it is for there to be a member of the community that's willing to raise these issues and ask tough questions. That is important, especially, again, when it's done consistently and when it's done from a constructive place. If you're opening up that space for dialogue, that's critical. And I will often say that if you have difficult public leaders, that first step is often opening up space for dialogue in the first place. And then it's about introducing talking points and getting them to basically change their mind. Okay, and then lastly, I just want to mention a few things for your radar. I saw that SAFE is currently advocating to the EPA for tough new regulations on the power plant sector. I think that's very wise to be keeping an eye on the agencies in the executive branch. That's where a lot of the action is going to be in the years ahead. We all know that. At the same time, there are some things in Congress that we shouldn't lose track of. So while the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, likely represents the biggest piece of proactive climate legislation we'll see probably for the foreseeable future, there are some other important elements that are must-pass bills that may come up in the meantime. Number one on my list right now is this year's Farm Bill. The Farm Bill comes up for reauthorization every 5 years. It is a really critical bill that governs a number of agriculture and food programs, including subsidies, which is really a key element of that piece of legislation. as I mentioned earlier, our food systems are so integral to our climate response, as you saw in the solutions graph, that the 2023 Farm Bill must be a climate bill. It must begin incentivizing the agricultural practices that Project Drawdown has identified in order for us to have a realistic shot at meeting our obligations under the Paris Agreement. So I would say if this is something that interests you, probably engage your leaders sooner rather than later. I would assume this will be passed probably towards the end of the year, but I'm not entirely sure. And Michelle, I'm happy to look into that too if you're interested and follow up. Another one that I'll point out is the appropriations process. This is an important process to track for every issue. Many funding decisions from Congress, as you know, will have a critical impact on climate. The process can be a little complicated, but I would suggest asking your offices, your members of Congress and their staff, what's the best way for SAFE to engage on appropriations that impact the climate? They should be willing to tell you, even if you're at a fundamental disagreement, good staffers will still give you the sort of instructions on how to weigh in. And they usually have forms that you can fill out in the beginning of the year, where you can sort of give your input and things like that. So I would really suggest looking into that as well. And I would say, don't forget that foreign assistance is a huge part of our climate response. As I just mentioned, all of those solutions that are applicable to the developing countries, a lot of that will, at least from the United States side, if there is any financing that comes for it, it will come through the appropriations process. Happy to talk more about that too, if there are questions about it. And then lastly, again, this is sort of a general suggestion, but hopefully it's useful. State level legislation will be more and more critical in the years ahead. I would say identifying trusted allies who can help local groups navigate and track legislation can help lighten the load for central organizers, because it's very difficult to track all these state legislative processes. And I know your communities are spread around. If you can develop local level relationships, like Sierra Club probably tracks this stuff, that kind of thing, having somebody who's the go-to, I think is really important in this. Okay, I hope that those suggestions were helpful for you. I know you all are advanced level advocates, so I really do hope this was useful for you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.